The last decade has been one of the most transformative periods in video game history. We've seen games become larger, more ambitious, more cinematic, and increasingly willing to experiment with what the medium can actually do. But among the thousands of games released during this period, only a handful genuinely changed the expectations of players and developers. These aren't necessarily the games that invented their genres, nor are they automatically the highest-rated games of the decade. Instead, these are games that took an existing formula, completely rethought an important part of it, and demonstrated a new direction that other developers could follow. From open-world exploration and role-playing games to roguelikes, cooperative adventures, and multiplayer platforms, these 10 games helped define what their respective genres could become. Number 10. It Takes Two redefining cooperative games. Cooperative games have existed almost as long as video games themselves, but for a long time, co-op was treated as an additional feature rather than the foundation of a game's design. A game could be played alone, and if the developers wanted, they could add a second player who would essentially accompany the first. It Takes Two took the exact opposite approach. Developed by Hazelight Studios and released in 2021, the game was designed from the ground up around the idea that two people have to work together. There isn't a traditional single-player mode where one person can simply experience the entire game alone. Cooperation isn't an optional feature. It is the entire point. What makes this game particularly impressive is the sheer variety of mechanics it introduces. Instead of giving both players the same abilities and asking them to perform the same actions, the game constantly gives the two characters different tools that complement one another. One player might control a weapon while the other has an ability that interacts with it. One person might manipulate an object while the other uses it to reach a new area. The game repeatedly introduces new mechanics, teaches you how they work, lets you enjoy them for a while, and then moves on to something completely different. You can go from platforming to puzzle solving, then into a boss fight, then suddenly find yourself playing an entirely different style of game. It feels almost like several different genres have been compressed into one adventure. The genius of It Takes Two is that its gameplay also supports its narrative. The two protagonists, Cody and May, are a married couple whose relationship is falling apart, and after being transformed into dolls, they are forced to work together to repair their relationship. Their problems as characters are reflected in the mechanics. Communication, coordination, and understanding aren't simply themes mentioned in dialogue. They're things the actual players have to practice. If you and your friend aren't communicating, you're probably going to struggle. If you understand what the other player is doing and coordinate properly, the game becomes significantly easier and more enjoyable. This approach helped prove that cooperative multiplayer could be much more than two people shooting enemies together. This game showed that cooperation itself can be a gameplay mechanic, a storytelling tool, and even the emotional foundation of an entire game. At a time when couch co-op was becoming increasingly rare, Hazelight demonstrated that there was still enormous potential in designing games specifically around two people experiencing something together. Number 9. God of War, redefining the cinematic action game. When people think about the original God of War, they probably think about violence, massive bosses, Greek mythology, and an extremely angry man destroying everything in his path. Kratos was essentially the embodiment of spectacle. The original games were built around the fantasy of becoming an unstoppable warrior capable of fighting gods and monsters on a ridiculous scale. So when Sony Santa Monica announced a new God of War in 2018, one of the biggest surprises was how dramatically the franchise had changed. This wasn't simply a graphical upgrade or another chapter in the same formula. It was almost a reinvention of the character and the series itself. Kratos was older, quieter, and far more restrained. Instead of being driven almost entirely by rage and revenge, he was now dealing with the responsibility of raising his son. The relationship between the two became the emotional core of the game. Kratos is trying to teach his son how to survive, but at the same time, he is trying to prevent his son from inheriting the same destructive tendencies that ruined his own life. The gameplay changed just as dramatically. The camera moved from the distant third-person perspective of the older games to a much closer over-the-shoulder viewpoint. This made every attack feel heavier and more physical. The Leviathan axe became one of the most memorable weapons in modern action games because of its ability to be thrown and recalled. That simple mechanic created an enormous amount of satisfaction, particularly when you realized that the axe could interact with the environment and different combat situations. But perhaps the game's most technically ambitious feature was its camera. God of War was presented as a continuous shot, meaning the game avoids traditional cinematic cuts throughout its main journey. Characters walk through doors, travel between locations, fight enemies, and transition between gameplay and cinematic moments without the camera suddenly cutting away. This creates a remarkably seamless presentation and makes the entire adventure feel like one continuous journey. The game also deserves credit for demonstrating that a long-running franchise can evolve without completely abandoning its identity. God of War still has brutal combat, enormous monsters, spectacular set pieces, and mythology, but it places those elements inside a much more mature story. Instead of simply asking how powerful Kratos can become, it asks whether he can become a better person. God of War showed that a blockbuster action game could simultaneously be enormous in scale and deeply personal in its storytelling. Number 8. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, Redefining Action Combat. From Software spent the better part of a decade building and refining the Souls formula. Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and eventually Elden Ring all contributed to the modern Souls-like genre. But in 2019, From Software decided to do something different. Instead of making another game where players could customize nearly every aspect of their character, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice stripped away much of that flexibility and focused almost entirely on one thing: mastering the combat. At first glance, Sekiro might look like another Souls game. It has difficult enemies, huge bosses, mysterious locations, shortcuts, cryptic storytelling, and a protagonist who will die quite frequently. But once you actually play it, the differences become obvious. In a traditional Souls game, dodging is often your most important defensive tool. You learn an enemy's attack, roll away from it, wait for an opening, and strike. Sekiro wants you to do something much more aggressive. The game's combat revolves around posture. Instead of simply reducing an enemy's health until they die, you can break their posture by attacking them and, more importantly, successfully deflecting their attacks. When an enemy's posture breaks, you can perform a devastating death blow. This means that the player isn't necessarily trying to avoid combat. You're actively trying to stay in the fight and maintain pressure. This creates an almost rhythmic quality to combat. An enemy swings their sword, you deflect it, they attack again, you deflect again, and eventually the rhythm breaks in your favor. The best fights can almost feel like choreographed sword duels. You aren't simply memorizing attack patterns, you're learning the timing and cadence of your opponent. The game also removes one of the biggest safety nets present in traditional RPGs: character builds. You can't simply grind for hours, find an overpowered weapon, and completely trivialize the game's challenges. While there are tools and upgrades, the primary progression is the player's own skill. If you are struggling against a boss, the solution is usually not to find a better build. It's to understand what you're doing wrong. That design philosophy makes Sekiro one of the clearest examples of a game built around mastery rather than progression. It doesn't primarily ask you to make your character stronger. It asks you to become a better player. And that distinction is a major reason why its combat remains so influential. Number 7. Fortnite: Redefining the Modern Battle Royale Games. It would be inaccurate to say that Fortnite invented the Battle Royale genre. By the time Fortnite's Battle Royale mode arrived, games like PUBG had already demonstrated the commercial potential of the format. But Fortnite did something arguably even more significant. It transformed the Battle Royale into a constantly evolving social and entertainment platform. The basic idea was simple. 100 players are dropped onto a map. They collect equipment, fight one another, and attempt to become the last player standing. But Fortnite had another major advantage: building. Originally associated with the game's PvE mode, building became one of the defining mechanics of Battle Royale. Players could instantly create walls, ramps, and structures, transforming the battlefield into something far more dynamic than the static environments found in traditional shooters. But the real revolution happened after launch. Epic Games began treating Fortnite less like a finished product and more like a constantly evolving platform. Seasons introduced new locations, mechanics, characters, and storylines. The map could change dramatically from one period to another. Events could take place inside the game world and permanently alter the experience. Then Fortnite started crossing over with virtually every corner of popular culture. Superheroes, musicians, movies, television shows, anime characters, and other video game franchises appeared inside the game. Players weren't simply buying a game anymore. They were participating in an evolving digital space that reflected whatever was happening in entertainment and popular culture at the time. The game's virtual concerts were another major step. Artists could perform inside Fortnite while millions of players watched together. This blurred the boundary between video game, social platform, and entertainment service. Fortnite increasingly became somewhere you could go to socialize, watch an event, participate in a limited-time experience, or simply spend time with friends. The biggest legacy of Fortnite, therefore, isn't simply the Battle Royale format. It's the live service model and the idea that a video game can become a persistent digital world that changes alongside its audience. Many games today borrow some part of this philosophy, whether through seasonal content, collaborations, virtual events, or constantly evolving worlds. Number 6. Baldur's Gate 3 redefining the modern RPG genre. For much of modern gaming history, the traditional computer role-playing game occupied a relatively unique position. CRPGs could be incredibly deep, but their complexity could also make them intimidating. Games based on tabletop systems often demanded patience, knowledge of statistics, and an understanding of mechanics that mainstream audiences weren't necessarily looking for. Developed by Larian Studios and released in 2023, based on the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, the game gives players an enormous number of ways to approach situations. What makes the game exceptional is its reactivity. In many RPGs, your choices create the illusion of freedom. You might select one dialogue option instead of another, but eventually both paths lead to roughly the same destination. Baldur's Gate 3 frequently goes much further. You can talk to animals. You can speak with corpses. You can sneak into areas you're not supposed to enter. You can convince enemies to leave. You can accidentally kill characters who were supposed to play major roles. You can solve problems through combat, dialogue, deception, magic, or environmental manipulation. The game doesn't always ask, what solution did the developers intend? Combat follows the same philosophy. The player has access to an enormous number of abilities and environmental interactions. You can manipulate surfaces, exploit positioning, push enemies from heights, combine abilities, and use the environment to create unexpected outcomes. And failure is often treated as part of the experience rather than something that must be corrected immediately. Killing the wrong character or failing an important conversation doesn't necessarily mean you need to reload your save. The world simply reacts and continues. This creates an experience where every player's journey can be dramatically different. That is perhaps the greatest achievement of Baldur's Gate 3. It didn't simplify the CRPG genre to make it mainstream. Instead, it demonstrated that mainstream players were willing to embrace complexity when that complexity actually gave them meaningful freedom. Number 5. Outer Wilds, redefining what progression means. Some games reward you for becoming stronger. Others reward you for finding better equipment. Outer Wilds does neither. Instead, it rewards you for understanding. At first, Outer Wilds looks like a charming little space exploration game. You play as an astronaut exploring a miniature solar system filled with strange planets, ancient ruins, and mysterious phenomena. But after some time, you discover the game's central premise. The solar system is trapped in a 22-minute time loop. At the end of those 22 minutes, everything resets. Normally, this kind of system would be frustrating. Imagine playing an RPG where you lose all your weapons and upgrades every 20 minutes. But Outer Wilds has a brilliant solution. You keep your knowledge. You might discover a clue on one planet that explains something on another. You might find an ancient message describing a mysterious machine. You might learn that a planet changes dramatically as time passes. Slowly, the information begins connecting. The game doesn't stop you from visiting an area because your character isn't strong enough. It stops you because you don't understand how to reach it yet. That completely changes the concept of progression. Imagine discovering a locked door and realizing that you don't need a key. Instead, you need to understand why the door exists. Eventually, something you learned several hours ago suddenly becomes relevant, and you realize exactly what you need to do. The feeling is incredible because the achievement belongs entirely to you. The game also refuses to over-explain its mysteries. It trusts the player to connect the dots. The story is essentially an archaeological investigation where the player reconstructs the history of an extinct civilization by exploring their remains. This makes Outer Wilds one of the purest examples of discovery-driven game design. It demonstrates that progression doesn't necessarily have to be about acquiring power. Sometimes the most satisfying reward a game can give you is simply the answer to a question you've been asking. Number 4. Hades, redefining the roguelike genre. Roguelike games are built around failure. You start a run, fight through randomly generated encounters, collect upgrades, become stronger, and eventually die. Then you start again. For a genre built around repetition, this creates a natural storytelling problem. If the player keeps dying, how do you tell a traditional linear story? Supergiant Games found an incredibly elegant answer with Hades. You play as Zagreus, the son of Hades, attempting to escape the underworld. Every attempt takes you through a series of randomized rooms, enemies, and upgrades. Eventually, you will probably die and return to the House of Hades. But instead of the story stopping, the story continues. Characters remember what happened. They comment on your previous attempts. New conversations appear. Relationships develop. Suddenly, dying isn't simply failure. Dying is part of the story. This is one of the most important innovations in Hades. The roguelike loop and the narrative aren't competing with one another. They're supporting each other. The reason you keep playing isn't simply because you want to complete a better run. You also want to know what happens next. The gameplay itself is equally important. While the game's boons allow you to combine abilities from the Greek gods in countless ways, one run might focus heavily on critical damage, while another might revolve around lightning, projectiles, or status effects. This means that every run feels slightly different while still maintaining a tight and responsive combat system. And because the game constantly gives you something new to discover, repetition rarely feels pointless. Hades showed that procedural gameplay doesn't have to come at the expense of storytelling. Instead, repetition can actually become a narrative mechanic. It helped push the roguelike genre further into the mainstream and demonstrated that failure can be one of the most satisfying forms of progression when the game is designed around it. Number 3. Disco Elysium, redefining narrative role-playing game. When you think about an RPG, the first thing that probably comes to mind is combat. Swords, guns, spells, enemies, experience points, loot, and character builds have become fundamental parts of the genre. Disco Elysium asks a very simple question. What if you removed almost all of that? The result is one of the strangest and most ambitious RPGs ever made. You play as a detective who wakes up in a destroyed hotel room with no memory of who he is. Your task is to investigate a murder, but the investigation quickly becomes something much larger. You are also trying to reconstruct your own identity, understand the political environment around you, and deal with the voices inside your own head. Those voices are represented through your skills. Logic can argue with you. Empathy can influence your decisions. Authority can push you toward dominance. Conceptualization can lead you into bizarre philosophical ideas. Inland Empire can produce completely irrational thoughts. Your character sheet isn't simply a collection of statistics. It's a collection of personalities. This creates an incredibly unusual role-playing experience. Instead of choosing whether your character should be a warrior, mage, or rogue, you are effectively deciding what kind of person your character is going to become. And failure is one of the game's greatest strengths. In a traditional RPG, failing an important skill check can feel like punishment. In Disco Elysium, failure can produce some of the funniest, strangest, or most memorable moments in the game. You can make terrible decisions, and the story doesn't necessarily punish you by forcing you to reload. Instead, The consequences become part of your character's story. The game also tackles politics, ideology, addiction, poverty, trauma, class, and identity with an unusual level of depth. It isn't afraid to be strange, uncomfortable, or intellectually demanding. Most importantly, Disco Elysium proved that dialogue and investigation could provide the same sense of progression and discovery that combat usually provides in an RPG. It showed that role-playing doesn't require killing enemies. It requires making choices and living with them. Number 2. Elden Ring redefining the Souls-like genre. By the time Elden Ring released in 2022, open-world games had become almost synonymous with massive maps filled with activities. You could open your map and immediately see dozens of objectives, collectibles, and locations waiting to be cleared. From Software went in a different direction. Elden Ring took the core philosophy of the Souls series and expanded it into an enormous open world without completely losing the mystery that made those games special. The lands between doesn't constantly tell you where to go. Instead, it gives you landmarks. You might see an enormous castle in the distance and decide to travel toward it. Along the way, you might discover a cave. Inside the cave might be an enemy, a weapon, a strange character, or a boss. Then you might leave the cave and notice something else in the distance. The world constantly creates curiosity. And perhaps the biggest improvement to the Souls formula is freedom. In previous From Software games, encountering a difficult boss often meant you had to figure out how to overcome that specific obstacle. In Elden Ring, you can simply leave. If Margit is destroying you, go somewhere else. Explore a dungeon. Find a new weapon. Upgrade your character. Discover a completely different area. Then return when you're ready. This freedom dramatically changed the accessibility of the Souls formula without making it fundamentally easier. The game's world also maintains From Software's trademark environmental storytelling. Instead of explaining everything through lengthy cinematics, the world itself becomes part of the narrative. Giant structures, ruined civilizations, enemy placement, architecture, and item descriptions slowly reveal the history of the lands between. The result is an open world that feels less like a theme park and more like an actual place. And this is where Elden Ring became so influential. It demonstrated that open-world design doesn't have to mean removing mystery. A massive map can actually become more interesting when the developer trusts the player to explore it without constantly explaining what they're looking at. Number 1. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, redefining the open world. If Elden Ring refined the open world formula, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild helped redefine it in the first place. Released in 2017 alongside the Nintendo Switch, Breath of the Wild arrived at a time when open-world games were becoming increasingly predictable. The typical structure was familiar. Unlock a tower, reveal the map, follow quest markers, clear activities, collect items, and repeat. Nintendo looked at that formula and essentially asked, what if we stopped telling the player what to do? The answer was Breath of the Wild. From the moment you leave the Great Plateau, almost the entire world is open to you. You can see a mountain in the distance and climb it. You can walk toward a strange structure. You can glide across enormous distances. You can simply wander in a direction because something caught your attention. The world itself becomes the interface. Rather than relying heavily on objective markers, Nintendo uses visual design to guide the player. A strange building might attract your attention. Smoke rising in the distance might suggest that something is happening there. A mountain might make you wonder what is on top. This design encourages curiosity rather than obedience. The game's physics and systemic interactions take that philosophy even further. Fire can spread through grass. Metal objects conduct electricity. Wind can affect objects. Explosives can be manipulated. Objects can be launched through the air. Players can combine different mechanics to solve problems in ways that the developers never explicitly explain. This is where Breath of the Wild became more than just another open-world game. It became a sandbox. The player isn't simply consuming content that the developer placed in front of them. They're experimenting with systems and creating their own solutions. Even the game's traversal contributes to this philosophy. Climbing allows you to approach locations from almost any direction, while gliding gives you another way to navigate the environment. Of course, Breath of the Wild wasn't perfect. Its weapon durability system remains one of its most controversial mechanics, and some players felt that the world could become repetitive or that its traditional dungeon design was weaker than earlier Zelda games. But those criticisms don't diminish its influence. Its importance comes from changing what players expected from open-world design. After Breath of the Wild, developers had another example of how an open world could be built around freedom, experimentation, and discovery instead of simply filling a map with activities. And that's why it deserves the #1 spot. Not because it invented open worlds, not because it was the first game to give players freedom, but because it demonstrated at an enormous scale that the most powerful open-world objective can simply be curiosity. What makes these 10 games special isn't that they were all perfect. In fact, many of them have obvious flaws. Some have controversial mechanics, some have technical problems, and others have design decisions that players strongly disagree with. What connects them is that each game took something that already existed and pushed it in a direction that changed the conversation around its genre. The most genre-defining games aren't necessarily the ones that create something completely new. More often, they're the games that look at an established formula and ask a simple question: what if we did this differently? And when that question is answered well enough, an entire industry starts asking the same thing. If you enjoyed the video, consider pressing the like button, and if you have a specific list you want to watch, let me know in the comments. Until then, goodbye, and I'll see you in the next one.